Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of my Ecto-1 Mad Max build. In my previous video I wrapped up most of the work on the body of the car. In this video I plan to focus on the base and suspension. In this case a lifted suspension to give clearance and to get that menacing look a Mad Max car has. Now I'm going to be honest, I'm not a suspension expert or a car expert in general. As such, it'll be your job to school me on the correct lingo and whatnot in the comments. I tend to just build what I like to look at and not what is realistic when it comes to these sorts of cars. Anyway, that's my simple excuse as to why I don't know all the names or correct scale of items I add to this car. It really boils down to what looks cool and what fits. I decided to make the suspension out of copper wire the same diameter as the original axle. I chose copper as it's easy to bend, but a wire coat hanger would also have worked well. I'm not going to go over the shape and how to bend the wire here, as I have an entire video dedicated on building this sort of thing, and we'll leave a link in the video if you want to check that out. I made two assemblies with the rear assembly a little bit larger than the front to give the vehicle some rake. This will be even more dramatic when the back wheels go on. To make things easy on myself, I used a small amount of super glue to hold both wire parts in place. Later, when I'm sure I have everything where I want it, I'll permanently glue them in, but at this point I could easily break the bond if I needed to replace one. For the axle assemblies, I'll use some brass tubing and an aluminum rod that fits perfectly inside the brass tube. Each tube is cut with a Dremel cutoff wheel and then sanded to remove burrs. I use the cutoff wheels as they do not collapse the tube like most other cutting methods. Once they are cleaned up and test fit, I'll glue them into place with some Starbond medium super glue. After the glue sets up, I started working with some weathering powders. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, but I wanted to see how things would look before I settle on the items I was using. There's no set instructions for how to build this car, and if you ever try one, you might find you do a lot of back and forth like I do. I tend to paint and weather things as I go if I'm not 100% sure where I'm going. It just makes everything easier to correct if I can see them in their final state before moving on. Now I'm ready for some wheels, and I have two choices here. I can look for some that are pre-made, or I can 3D print them. I obviously went with the second option. This allows me to create wheels that fit the car the way I want them to, and allows me to easily modify them. For example, I wanted the wheels to have cuts and cracks in the sidewalls, so all I needed to do was add these items into the 3D model before I printed them. As I said in my last video, I'm using a 3D resin printer, the Anycubic Photon. It's a $300 printer at the time of this video, and worth every penny. These 3D UV LCD printers give resolutions that a normal PLA printer just can't do at this small scale. I do plan to do a 3D printing video soon, and I'll go over how to use it then, so be on the lookout. The resin I'm using is from MakerJuice Labs, and I'll leave a link below so you can check them out. As a general rule, I like using resin over PLA and other materials as it's much easier to sand and drill, which is the next step after I printed the parts. I used my hobby lathe to drill out the hole for the axle. This was unnecessary. I could have just put the hole into the 3D model, but I knew I'd be using the lathe to sand the wheels anyway, so I figured I'd just take care of it on the lathe. After the sanding and drilling was done, I cut the aluminum rods to fit, pressing the wheels onto the rod, leaving a small amount of space between the wheel and the brass tubing. This way the wheels would not bind up on the brass rod. After assembling the front and back, I tested out the new wheels to be sure everything was aligned correctly and that the base would roll. Next I printed out the bottom half of an engine, including the exhaust manifold and the transmission. Originally I wanted to cut a hole in the hood and have the engine poking through with a big bug catcher intake, but all the door opening mechanics are on the hood of this car, so I figured since I was lifting the car I could have the bottom half of the engine sticking out and install some exhaust pipes. Maybe not as cool as the bug catcher intake, but I have done that several times, so it might be fun to do something a little different. After I removed all the support structures, I began test fitting the engine on the base. I had to do some sanding on the engine, but found I also needed to modify the base to remove parts that were sticking out. I did this with a Dremel and a spherical burr tool, which makes quick work of plastic. After this, I test fit the engine again and found it now sat flat against the base. Before I glue it in though, I figured I should go ahead and paint it. Here I'm using some Vallejo metal color to do just that. Airbrushing while being way too zoomed in and keeping everything in frame is hard. But eventually I got it done, and once it was dry I applied some Citadel wash to grime it up. If you don't have any wash, you can make some by adding a small amount of oil paint to a large amount of mineral spirits. Mix well and then apply. Next, I wanted to add some rust weathering powder to the exhaust manifolds. The best way I've found to do this is to apply some matte clear coat to the engine and then apply the rust powder to the items you want while the clear coat is still wet. This helps the powder stick, and you can build up layers by spraying the item again and reapplying the powders. After everything is dry, I can add the engine to the base with some super glue. I'm using the engine and exhaust molded onto the base as a sort of guide to where my engine should go. While I have the glue out, I'll also glue on the rear differential to the back axle assembly. I just modeled this diff in Tinkercad. It's not very detailed as I plan to rust it out and add dirt later. Next, I'll glue in the drive shaft. Here again, I'm just using some brass rod and some aluminum rod that fits inside. To make things fit better, I cut the end of the brass rod at a slight angle. I'll glue this in off camera as it's quite fiddly to mess with. Now I'm going to start working on the exhaust pipes. Sort of like a cooking show, I've already prepared the passenger side so you can see what I'm going for. I decided to scratch build the exhaust since I've used the 3D printer for the other items. The exhaust is made up of several lengths of tubing that all fit inside each other. The largest tubing has its end cut at an angle for that familiar exhaust look. I realize that you would not leave your exhaust dangling in the breeze like this in the real world. Here I'm just taking some creative license and going with what I think looks good. Several people commented that I should bring the exhaust through the front wheel wells, but again I've done that several times now with my Mad Max Batmobile coming to mind. I'll leave a link below if you want to see that build. Anyway, I'm not really trying to keep them symmetrical or anything like that. I figure a desert-dwelling post-apocalyptic mechanic would not care about such things if they put exhaust pipes in at all. The copper rod is used as it's easy to bend so I can point the exhaust in any direction I desire. Now I'll start adding in some reinforcement elements to the build. These are not necessary to reinforce this model, but I will assume they would be necessary for the real car if you were to lift it like this. Again, I'm using copper wire that I have straightened out. You could use anything really. Styrene would probably be even easier, but I like using the wire as I can bend it after I've glued it all together. This helps in getting the form just right. There's no trick to any of this, I'm just making a bunch of triangles. I will say this is where the Starbond glue accelerator really helps, as it sets the glue in about a second, which helps glue in these very small parts and my fingers together. Once the glue is fully cured, it's airbrush time again. I'll be using the same metallic aluminum color as I did on the engine to paint in the exhaust. The overspray is a bit of a pain, but it'll be easy to clean that up later. The metallic paint is just the undercoat, and a lot of it will be covered up in the future. Once that metallic paint dries, I'll start painting in all the frame with a rust-colored acrylic and a brush. Here I move to using a brush to limit the overspray of the airbrush. Now that I have all my base coats in, it's time to go over everything with the wash to blend them all together. While the wash dries, I'm going to completely shift gears and start cutting out some styrene shapes on the full spectrum laser. These shapes were made on a free program called DraftSight. The files are then uploaded to the laser software as vector images and then sent to the laser which cuts them out. You could always do all this by hand, but having this set up means the complete process from start to finish is about 5 minutes. This is extremely helpful when you have a YouTube channel and trying to get videos out. Once the parts are cut out, I'll start gluing them to a small piece of square brass tubing. This tubing will be the new bumper, so to speak, and the styrene parts will be the large ram spikes that will be welded onto the bumper. Putting some sort of cattle pusher or spikes was the most requested item to add to this model in the last video, so this is my way of doing both at the same time. The small U-shaped tabs are what I will use to bond the new bumper to the base. Later I'll come back and reinforce this off camera with some small wood dowels. I'm not sure how realistic something like this would be in real life. I assume it would have a one-time use at best, but it would sure look ominous from your rearview mirror as it started bearing down on you. I used my airbrush to paint it off camera in the same color as the frame. Now I'm going to make it look like freshly rusted steel. To do this, I'll use some weathering powder, but I'll use it like a wash. To convert a weathering powder to a wash, you add in a little isopropyl alcohol and mix. You then apply the rust wash to the item, and then let it set aside to dry. Just like a regular wash, the rust wash will pull up in cracks and corners to apply more rust in these areas. This works really well for items you're trying to make look welded together, like these metal spikes. Now I'm going to turn to the wheels, or more specifically the metal rims. First I'll use my airbrush to paint in the metallic silver as an undercoat. I'm purposely pulling up the paint here with my airbrush to give some texture. Then I'll apply some of the Known Oil wash for grime. And then last I'll use a little of the rust wash for good measure. The last thing I need to do with the wheels is give them a road-worn look. This is very easy to do since they're made of resin. When you sand resin, the area you sand turns white, so all I have to do is go over the wheels with some sandpaper and rough up the tread. The last thing I'll need to do for this model is to add in highlights and shadows. I'll start with the shadows, which I'm using a black acrylic to represent. This is mostly used on the exhaust and the end of the gun barrel, but I also applied a little in the wheel wells and other areas I wanted to sort of hide. For my highlights, I'll use a bright gray, which is not only a great oxymoron, but also a great road dust color. This is applied anywhere there should be a lot of dust accumulation. You typically need to underuse this. Most cars in the real world would be completely covered in this, but that doesn't make for a cool look, so use sparingly. Alright, so needless to say, this has been one of my larger builds, and I would have to say it was a lot of fun. I did take several of your recommendations and apply them to this car, though I didn't go into each for this video as most are things that you've already seen in some way or the other. A lot of things people recommended I would have loved to have included, but could not include without doing real damage to the work I've already put into this model. A lot of my thought process on this car was to be sure that it was unique compared to other cars I have made. I mentioned before that some time back I built a Mad Max Batmobile, and though this car has some similarities, I put a lot of effort into making sure this model was different when compared to that one. The other trick for this car was to make sure that the Ecto-1 was still somewhat recognizable. So far everyone I've shown it to sees Ecto-1, so I think I was able to pull that off. But of course I want to know what you think, so let me know below. I have a bunch of restoration videos in the works, so I'll be seeing you soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.